There's something uniquely devastating about returning home to find that the world you left behind has transformed in your absence. For Marcus Wilson, a 36-year-old former Special Forces operative, this reality struck with the force of an unseen enemy the moment he stepped through the front door of what was once his family home. 3 years of deployment had left their mark on Marcus. The faint scar above his right eyebrow, the slight limp from a mission gone wrong in Kandahar, and the perpetual vigilance that never quite faded even in supposedly safe environments. But nothing in his military training had prepared him for the battlefield of suburban America, where the enemies wore friendly faces and the casualties were measured in stolen innocence rather than body counts. It was a crisp October morning when Marcus's taxi pulled up to the two-story Colonial in Cedar Grove. The maple trees that lined the driveway had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, just as he remembered. The white picket fence that he had painted the weekend before his deployment needed a fresh coat. Some things change, others remain stubbornly the same. The divorce papers had arrived 6 months into his last tour, a clinical dissolution of 15 years of marriage, justified by Anna's claim that she couldn't live as a ghost widow any longer. He had signed them without protest. The military had taught him when to fight and when to concede defeat, but he had fought for one thing: visitation rights with Sophie, his 10-year-old daughter, his North Star, his reason for coming home alive. The woman who answered the door was still recognizable as Anna, his high school sweetheart, the mother of his child. But something in her eyes had hardened. Her smile was practiced, political. The embrace they shared felt like a formality between distant acquaintances. "You're looking well, Marcus. Come in. Sophie's upstairs getting ready. She's excited to see you." The hesitation in her voice was the first warning sign. The second was the immaculate state of the house. Not a toy out of place, not a speck of dust on any surface. This wasn't the home of a child. It was a museum dedicated to perfection. "Richard's at work. He wanted to be here to welcome you, but there was an emergency at the hospital. You know how it is with doctors." Richard Hayes, the renowned child psychiatrist who had helped Anna through the difficult transition during Marcus's second deployment, now her husband of 2 years, the man who tucked Sophie in at night while Marcus slept in barracks half a world away. "How is she, Anna, really?" Anna's practiced smile faltered for just a moment. "She's adjusting. It's been a challenging year. Sophie's going through some developmental phases. Richard's been wonderful with her. His expertise has been invaluable." Before Marcus could press further, a small figure appeared at the top of the stairs. For a breathless moment, Marcus didn't recognize his own daughter. The Sophie he remembered was perpetual motion, running, jumping, her blonde curls flying behind her like a victory flag, her laughter echoing through rooms before she even entered them. This child moved with deliberate precision, each step measured, her once wild curls now pulled back into a severe ponytail. Her blue eyes, so like his own, seemed to observe rather than see. "Hi, Daddy." Her voice was soft, careful, lacking the exuberance that once defined her. She didn't run to him as she always had before. Instead, she descended the stairs with the caution of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "Hey, Soph Bear." The childhood nickname felt foreign on his tongue now, a relic from another life. When he knelt to embrace her, Sophie's arms wrapped around his neck with mechanical precision, neither too tight nor too loose. A proper hug, not a genuine one. "I made you a welcome home card," she said, presenting him with a carefully folded piece of construction paper. The artwork was impeccable, straight lines, colors that didn't bleed outside their designated spaces. Nothing like the joyful chaos of her previous creations that still adorned his wallet. "It's beautiful, Sophie, thank you." When he looked more closely at the drawing, something cold settled in his stomach. The picture showed 4 figures: Sophie, Anna, a tall man in a doctor's coat labeled Dad Richard, and a smaller figure standing apart from the group labeled simply Marcus. Not Daddy, not even Dad, just Marcus, like a distant relative or family friend. "Sophie, why don't you show your father the backyard? We've redone the garden since he was last home." The backyard had indeed transformed. The swing set where Marcus had pushed Sophie for countless hours was gone, replaced by a geometric stone patio and precisely trimmed hedges. Not a place for play, but for carefully controlled outdoor experiences. Sophie walked beside him, maintaining a perfect 2-foot distance, her hands clasped behind her back like a tour guide rather than a child in her own home. This is the new meditation garden. Dad Richard says it's important to have spaces for mindful reflection. I sit here for 30 minutes every day after school to process my emotions properly. The words sounded rehearsed, borrowed from an adult's vocabulary. Marcus knelt down again, bringing himself to Sophie's eye level. And what about the old oak tree, the one we were going to build a treehouse in? Sophie's eyes darted toward the house, as if checking whether anyone was watching through the windows. Dad Richard had it removed. He said it was diseased and might fall on the house, and tree houses are structurally unsound and promote dangerous behaviors. Marcus followed her gaze back toward the house, where Anna stood watching from the kitchen window. The unease that had been building since his arrival crystallized into something more defined. Something was very wrong here. "Sophie, are you happy?" The question seemed to confuse her. She tilted her head slightly, as if searching for the correct answer rather than feeling one. "I'm well adjusted and making appropriate developmental progress. My last psychological assessment showed significant improvement in behavioral regulation." Marcus felt as though he had been struck. These weren't a child's words. This was clinical language, the kind found in therapeutic evaluations, not in the thoughts of a 10-year-old girl. "That's not what I asked, sweetheart. I asked if you're happy." Sophie's carefully composed expression flickered, revealing something vulnerable beneath. For just a moment, his real daughter seemed to look out from behind the mask of this too-perfect child. "I'm trying to be good, Daddy. I'm trying really hard." Before he could respond, Anna called from the patio door. "Lunch is ready. Sophie, did you take your medication this morning?" The mask slipped back into place as Sophie nodded. "Yes, Mom, at 7:30 a.m. with breakfast, as scheduled." Medication. This was the first Marcus had heard of any medical issues. Sophie had always been healthy, wildly energetic and occasionally defiant, like any normal child, but never with any condition requiring regular medication. The dining room table was set with precision that would have impressed Marcus's drill sergeant. Anna served a lunch of carefully portioned chicken salad, exactly 3 strawberries per plate, and water in crystal glasses that seemed absurdly delicate for a home with a child. "So, Marcus, how long will you be staying in Cedar Grove?" "I've rented an apartment downtown. I'm here permanently. My discharge papers came through last month." Anna's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Permanently? I thought this was just a visit before your next assignment." "No, I'm done. 15 years was enough. I'm starting civilian life now." The implication hung in the air between them. He was here to be a father again, a real presence in Sophie's life, not just a voice on occasional phone calls and a visitor during leave. "Well, that's wonderful. Isn't that wonderful, Sophie? Your father will be around more often." Sophie nodded obediently, but her eyes remained fixed on her plate, meticulously spearing one piece of lettuce at a time. "I've already enrolled in a mechanical engineering program at State. The GI Bill is covering it. I have savings to carry me through until I can find work." "That sounds very responsible," Anna replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Richard and I have been focusing on stability for Sophie. Her routine is very important for her progress." "Progress with what exactly? What medication is she taking, Anna?" Sophie's shoulders tensed at the direct question, though she continued eating with robotic precision. "Richard diagnosed her with an anxiety disorder and attention regulation issues last year. The medication helps her focus and manage her emotional responses. It's been transformative for her academic performance." Marcus studied his daughter, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes seemed to lose focus momentarily before snapping back to attention. "She seems different." Anna's smile tightened. "She's growing up, Marcus. Children change. Richard has helped her channel her energy in more productive directions. Her teachers have noticed remarkable improvement." "Dad Richard says I was wasting my potential before," Sophie offered, her voice flat. "Now I'm operating at appropriate capacity." The lunch continued with stilted conversation, primarily between Marcus and Anna. Sophie spoke only when directly addressed, her answers brief and oddly formal. When lunch concluded, she stood and carried her plate to the kitchen without being asked. then returned to the table. May I be excused to complete my afternoon reading assignment? Anna nodded approvingly. Of course, sweetheart. Remember to log your pages in your progress journal. As Sophie climbed the stairs, Marcus noticed that she counted each step under her breath, a ritual that seemed to provide some comfort in its predictability. What happened to her, Anna? That's not the Sophie I remember. Anna's pleasant facade cracked slightly. What happened is that while you were gone, I had to raise a child who was increasingly difficult to manage. Sophie was acting out, having tantrums, failing at school. Richard recognized the signs of her condition and has been treating her. The Sophie you remember was unregulated and chaotic. This Sophie is healthier. She doesn't seem like a child anymore. She seems like a robot programmed to please adults. Anna's eyes flashed with genuine anger. You don't get to disappear for years at a time and then come back questioning our parenting decisions. Richard is a respected child psychiatrist. He knows what Sophie needs. And what about what Sophie wants? Does anyone ask her that anymore? The conversation ended in tense silence. Anna excused herself to make phone calls, leaving Marcus alone in what had once been his home. After a few minutes, he climbed the stairs towards Sophie's bedroom, following the sound of a pencil scratching methodically against paper. The door to Sophie's room was ajar. The space beyond bore little resemblance to the colorful chaos he remembered. Gone were the stuffed animals piled high on the bed, the art supplies scattered across every surface, the glow-in-the-dark stars he had helped her stick to the ceiling. In their place was a minimalist room with white walls, a precisely made bed with gray bedding, and a small desk where Sophie sat with perfect posture, writing in a notebook. "Can I come in, Soph Bear?" She looked up, startled, then quickly composed herself. Yes, that would be acceptable. Marcus entered, taking in the sterile environment that seemed more appropriate for a laboratory than a child's bedroom. "What are you working on?" "My daily reflection journal. Dad Richard says it's important to document my thoughts and behaviors for later review." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, noticing how Sophie subtly shifted her body to maintain distance between them. "Do you enjoy writing in your journal?" Another pause, another search for the right answer. "It's a valuable therapeutic tool." "That's not what I asked." Sophie's pencil stilled. She seemed to be internally calculating something, weighing options, risks. Sometimes I write things I'm not supposed to, but then I erase them." This was the first genuine response she had given him. Marcus tried to keep his voice casual, non-threatening. "Like what kinds of things?" Sophie glanced toward her bedroom door, then lowered her voice. "Like how I miss the old swing set, and how the medicine makes my head feel fuzzy, and how I don't like it when Dad Richard asks me questions about my feelings for hours and hours until I say the right answers." The cold feeling in Marcus's stomach intensified. "Does Dad Richard read your journal?" Sophie nodded. "Every night. That's why I have to be careful what I write. He says honesty is important, but when I'm honest about not liking things, he says that's my condition talking, not the real me." Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral, despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "Sophie, do you remember when we used to have our special hiding place? For treasures that were just for us?" A flicker of genuine memory brightened her eyes. "Behind the loose baseboard in my closet." "Is it still there?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "Dad Richard doesn't know about it. I didn't tell him." "Good girl. That's our special secret, remember?" For the first time since his arrival, Sophie's smile seemed authentic, if fleeting. "I remember, Daddy." Anna's footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Sophie immediately returned to her journal, her posture stiffening, the mask sliding back into place. Anna appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully pleasant, but her eyes wary. "It's almost time for Sophie's afternoon activities. We have a very structured schedule." Marcus stood, maintaining his own facade of casual acceptance. "Of course, I should get going anyway. Need to finish setting up my apartment." He turned to Sophie. "I'll see you this weekend, Soph Bear. We're going to have a special day together, just you and me." Sophie nodded, but her eyes communicated something beyond her words, a mixture of hope and fear that tore at Marcus's heart. As Anna walked him to the door, her tone was professionally cordial. "Richard and I maintain a very specific therapeutic environment for Sophie. When you have her this weekend, We'd appreciate if you could follow the behavioral management guidelines. She handed him a thick folder. This outlines her medication schedule, acceptable activities, dietary restrictions, and protocols for handling emotional dysregulation. Marcus accepted the folder with a neutral expression, though internally he was reeling. What had they done to his vibrant, imaginative daughter? "I'll look these over," he promised, with no intention of following a single protocol that transformed a child into an automaton. After a stilted goodbye, Marcus walked to his rental car parked at the curb. Once inside, he finally allowed his composed expression to crumble. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel, a surge of rage and helplessness washing over him. The folder Anna had given him sat on the passenger seat like a manifesto for the systematic destruction of childhood joy. He drove to his new apartment, a sparse one-bedroom with minimal furniture and bare walls. The place had a temporary feel to it, as if he wasn't fully committed to civilian life. But as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the folder in his hands, Marcus knew he had found a new mission. Something was deeply wrong in the Hayes household, and Sophie was caught in the middle of it. Rather than opening Anna's folder of protocols, Marcus reached for his phone and searched for information on Dr. Richard Hayes. The results painted a picture of professional success. Graduated top of his class from Johns Hopkins, published extensively in psychiatric journals, specialized in childhood behavioral disorders. Current research focused on innovative treatments for attention and emotional regulation issues in children. What the search results didn't explain was why his own stepdaughter moved like a programmed drone, spoke like a miniature adult reciting a script, and watched doorways with the hypervigilance of a prisoner. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophie's vacant expression, the mechanical precision of her movements, the way she seemed to be constantly monitoring herself for acceptable behavior. This wasn't normal development, or even the result of regular therapy. This was something else entirely. The weekend couldn't come fast enough. When Saturday morning arrived, Marcus was at the Hayes residence precisely at 9:00 a.m., as stipulated in their custody agreement. Richard answered the door this time, a tall, distinguished-looking man in his late 40s with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Marcus, good to finally meet you in person. Anna's told me so much about you." The handshake they exchanged was firm, evaluative, each man taking the measure of the other. "Likewise, I appreciate the care you've taken with my daughter." If Richard detected the subtle challenge in Marcus's tone, he didn't show it. "Sophie's upstairs getting ready. She's been looking forward to your outing, though I should mention that excitement can trigger her symptoms. If you notice any hyperactivity or emotional outbursts, there's a rescue medication in her backpack with instructions." Marcus nodded, containing his growing concern behind a mask of cooperative interest. "I'll keep that in mind." Richard gestured for Marcus to enter. "I understand you've recently transitioned to civilian life. That must be quite an adjustment after so many years of service." "It has its challenges. I've worked with many veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress and reintegration difficulties. If you ever feel you might benefit from professional support, I'd be happy to recommend some excellent colleagues." The offer seemed benign on the surface, but Marcus recognized the subtle positioning, establishing Richard as the psychological authority, suggesting that Marcus might be unstable after his military service. It was a preemptive defense, laying groundwork to dismiss any concerns Marcus might raise about Sophie's treatment. "I appreciate that, but I'm adjusting well." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in a neatly pressed outfit that seemed better suited for a school interview than a casual day with her father. Her backpack was clutched in front of her like a shield. "Good morning, Dad Marcus. I'm ready for our scheduled recreation time." Dad Marcus. Not Daddy, not even Dad. The formal title felt like another wall between them. "Ready for an adventure, Soph Bear?" She descended the stairs with that same careful precision he had noticed during his first visit. "I've packed my emergency medication, my identification card, my reflection journal, and a nutritionally balanced lunch as specified in my meal plan." Richard placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, a gesture that appeared affectionate but seemed to make her stiffen slightly. "Remember your breathing exercises if you start feeling overwhelmed. And Marcus, Please ensure she takes her midday medication at exactly noon. We'll be fine, Marcus assured him, offering his hand to Sophie. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, her small fingers cold against his palm. As they walked to the car, Marcus noticed how Sophie constantly glanced back at the house, as if expecting to be recalled or corrected at any moment. "Where are we going?" she asked once they were driving away from Cedar Grove. "I thought we'd visit the Oak Creek Nature Preserve. Remember how we used to hike there and look for turtles by the pond?" For a brief moment, Sophie's face lit up with genuine excitement before she carefully composed her features again. Dad Richards says unstructured outdoor activities can lead to overstimulation and behavioral regression. And what do you think? Do you like being outdoors? The question seemed to confuse her, as if her own preferences were concepts she rarely considered. I, I used to like looking for turtles. Then that's what we'll do. The nature preserve was quiet that morning, with few other visitors on the trails. As they walked, Marcus deliberately slowed his pace, allowing Sophie to set the rhythm. At first, she maintained the same measured steps she displayed at home. But gradually, as they ventured deeper into the woods, something began to change. She stopped to examine a colorful leaf, then a strange mushroom growing on a fallen log. When a squirrel darted across their path, she laughed, a spontaneous, genuine sound that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh since his return. By the time they reached the pond, Sophie had removed her jacket, loosened her ponytail, and was moving with something closer to the natural exuberance of childhood. She crouched by the water's edge, searching for movement among the reeds. "Daddy, look, a baby turtle!" Daddy, not Dad Marcus. The simple word felt like a victory. They spent an hour by the pond, Sophie gradually becoming more animated, asking questions, making observations, even splashing water playfully when she thought Marcus wasn't looking. It was as if the further they got from the Hayes household, the more the real Sophie emerged from behind the mask of the perfect, regulated child. When lunchtime approached, Sophie automatically reached for her backpack, retrieving a precisely packed container with measured portions of food in a small pill case. "It's time for my medication." Marcus watched as she mechanically opened the pill case, removing a small blue tablet. "Sophie, what does this medicine do for you?" She looked at the pill in her palm, her expression clouding. "It helps me be good. It makes the loud thoughts quiet and helps me sit still and pay attention. Dad Richards says I have a chemical imbalance that makes me naturally disruptive, but the medicine fixes me. Do you feel better when you take it?" She hesitated, glancing around as if Richard might somehow overhear. "It makes me feel flat, like everything is gray instead of colorful. But when I don't take it, I get in trouble for being too emotional or too distracted. Dad Richards says that's how we know I need it, because I don't want to take it." Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral, despite the anger building inside him. "Does Dad Richard take any medicine?" Sophie shook her head. "He says his brain works correctly without help." "And what about before? Were you unhappy before you started taking the medicine?" Sophie seemed to be searching her memory, pushing through a fog. "I don't remember very well. Dad Richard says I was out of control and made Mom cry all the time. But," she looked up at Marcus, a flicker of her old self visible in her eyes, "I remember laughing more and dreaming. I don't dream much anymore." Marcus made a decision that he knew might be controversial, even potentially dangerous given Richard's professional status. "Sophie, what if we try something? Just for today. What if we don't take the medicine and see how you feel? This can be our special secret." Fear and hope battled in Sophie's expression. "But Dad Richards says I need it. He says my brain doesn't work right without it." "I think your brain works beautifully just as it is, and one afternoon without medicine won't hurt. If you start feeling bad, you can take it right away. But maybe, just maybe, you'll find you feel more like yourself without it." Sophie stared at the pill for a long moment before slowly returning it to the case. "Okay, just for today." They continued their hike after lunch, venturing to parts of the preserve they had never explored before. With each passing hour, Sophie became more animated, her movements more natural, her laughter more frequent. By mid-afternoon, she was running ahead on the trail, calling back to Marcus to hurry up, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm he had feared was lost forever. When it was time to return home, Sophie's transformation was remarkable. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy exertion, her hair had escaped its severe ponytail entirely, and her speech pattern had shifted from formal, measured statements to the excited rambling typical of a 10-year-old recounting adventures. As they approached the car, however, her steps began to slow. The light in her eyes dimmed as she looked toward the road that would take them back to Cedar Grove. "We have to go home now, don't we?" "Yes, sweetheart, but we'll have another day together soon." Sophie climbed into the car silently, staring out the window as Marcus drove. About halfway back to the Hayes residence, she spoke again, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. "I don't want to take the medicine anymore, Daddy, but I'm scared of what will happen if I don't." "What are you scared might happen?" "Dad Richard gets angry when I don't follow the protocols. He doesn't yell or anything. He just gets very quiet and disappointed and says I'm choosing to be sick. Then he increases my therapy sessions. Sometimes," she hesitated, her voice dropping even lower, "sometimes he makes me sit in the quiet room in the basement until I'm ready to cooperate with my treatment plan." A chill ran through Marcus. "The quiet room, what's that like?" "It's small and white with no windows. There's just a chair and a timer. I have to sit perfectly still until the timer runs out. But if I move or make noise, he restarts it. Sometimes it takes hours before I can get out." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, struggling to control his reaction. This wasn't therapy. This was something much more disturbing. "Sophie, has Dad Richard ever hurt you? Physically, I mean." She shook her head. "No, he says violence is for people who lack intellectual solutions, but," you see, she hesitated again. "Sometimes he gives me special medicine that makes me sleep when I'm having what he calls an acute episode of defiance. I don't like that medicine. It gives me scary dreams." As they pulled into the driveway of the Hayes residence, Sophie's transformation reversed itself with alarming speed. She smoothed her clothes, retied her ponytail, and straightened her posture. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by the watchful caution he had observed during his first visit. By the time they reached the front door, she had fully reassumed her mask of perfect, regulated behavior. Richard opened the door before they could knock, his expression pleasant, but his eyes sharp as they took in Sophie's slightly disheveled appearance. "Welcome back. Did you two have a productive outing?" Sophie nodded, her voice returning to its formal cadence. "Yes, Dad Richard. We engaged in appropriate recreational activities and nature observation." Richard placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, guiding her inside. "Why don't you go upstairs and change into clean clothes? Then you can write about your day in your reflection journal." Once Sophie was out of earshot, Richard turned to Marcus, his smile never reaching his eyes. "How did she do? Any issues with emotional regulation?" "None. She was a perfectly normal, happy 10-year-old girl." Something flickered across Richard's face, annoyance perhaps, or concern. "Did she take her midday medication?" The direct question left no room for evasion. Marcus had known this confrontation was inevitable from the moment he had suggested skipping the pill. She didn't need it. She was calm, engaged, and joyful without chemical intervention. Richard's expression hardened. "I see. I understand you may have concerns about Sophie's treatment plan, Marcus. Many parents struggle to accept a diagnosis of psychological or neurological disorders in their children. But I assure you these medications are prescribed for Sophie's benefit, not as some form of control. Then why does she behave like a completely different child, a happier, more authentic child, when she's not taking them? What you perceive as authentic may simply be her condition manifesting. Uninhibited behavior can feel like freedom, but for children with Sophie's issues, it's often a sign that they're losing the tools they need to function in structured environments like school." The reasonable tone, the scientific language, the subtle positioning of Marcus as the misunderstanding layman versus Richard as the informed expert, it was all masterfully done. If Marcus hadn't seen the transformation with his own eyes, hadn't heard Sophie's fear of the quiet room, he might have been swayed. "I'd like to see her medical records in the specific diagnosis that justifies medicating a child to the point that she loses her personality." Richard's smile remained fixed, but his eyes turned cold. "As Sophie's stepfather and physician of record, I'm afraid I can't share confidential medical information without Anna's consent. But I'm happy to recommend some reading materials about childhood anxiety and attention disorders that might help you understand Sophie's condition better. The dismissal was clear. In Richard's world, Marcus was an outsider, unqualified to question the treatment of his own daughter. I'll look forward to those recommendations, Marcus replied, matching Richard's professionally pleasant tone while internally vowing to uncover the truth behind Sophie's transformation. That night, in his sparse apartment, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Sophie's face as they'd driven back to Cedar Grove. The fear gradually replacing the joy, the light dimming in her eyes with each mile that brought them closer to home. He remembered the quiet room she had described, the special medicine administered during episodes of defiance, the constant monitoring and correction of normal childhood behaviors. Something was very wrong in the Hayes household, and Marcus was increasingly convinced that the primary threat to Sophie's well-being wasn't some dubious psychological condition, but the very man claiming to treat it. Unable to sleep, Marcus returned to his research on Richard Hayes. This time, he dug deeper than the professional accolades in published papers. He searched for former patients, reviews, anything that might reveal the man behind the polished facade. Most of what he found reinforced the image of Hayes as a respected authority in child psychiatry. But buried among the praise were concerning outliers. A parent's complaint about personality changes in their child after beginning treatment with Dr. Hayes, a former patient, now an adult, describing feeling erased by Hayes' therapeutic approach. A nurse who had filed a complaint about unusual treatment protocols before abruptly withdrawing it and moving to another state. None of it constituted proof of wrongdoing, but together these fragments suggested something disturbing beneath the surface of Richard Hayes' pristine professional reputation. As dawn broke, Marcus made two decisions. First, he would document everything: Sophie's behavior with and without medication, her descriptions of Richard's therapy methods, the dramatic personality differences he had observed. Second, he would find allies, people who could help him understand what was happening and, if necessary, intervene on Sophie's behalf. The next day, Marcus drove to Oakwood Elementary, where Sophie attended 5th grade. He had arranged to meet with her teacher, Ms. Parker, during her planning period. The school was modern and well-equipped, with children's artwork lining the hallways in a general atmosphere of warmth and encouragement, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the Hayes household. Ms. Parker was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with a friendly smile and observant eyes that suggested she missed little that happened in her classroom. "Mr. Wilson, it's nice to meet you. Sophie mentioned you'd returned to Cedar Grove. Please, call me Marcus. I appreciate you making time to meet with me." They sat in her classroom, surrounded by books and colorful educational displays. On her desk, Marcus noticed a photograph of Sophie's class. He scanned the image, easily finding his daughter standing at the end of the back row, her posture perfect, her smile polite but empty compared to the goofy grins of her classmates. "I wanted to ask about Sophie's progress. Has she always been so—" He searched for the right word. "Composed at school?" Miss Parker's expression turned thoughtful. "No, not always. Sophie was quite different when she first joined my class last year. Energetic, creative, occasionally disruptive, but in that normal 5th grade way. Talking out of turn, daydreaming, the usual stuff." "When did that change?" Ms. Parker hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "There was an incident about 8 months ago. Sophie had what Dr. Hayes later described as an emotional dysregulation episode during art class. She became upset when another student accidentally spilled paint on her project. Nothing extreme. She cried, expressed frustration, normal reactions for a child experiencing disappointment. But afterward, Dr. Hayes came to the school for a meeting with the principal and counselor. That's when Sophie's formal assessment process began. And after that, she started medication shortly afterward. The change was dramatic. Within weeks, she went from being one of my most expressive students to one of the most reserved. Her academic performance improved in terms of test scores and homework completion, but her creative writing lost its spark. Her art became technically perfect, but emotionless, and she stopped participating in class discussions unless directly called upon. Marcus absorbed this information, his concern deepening. "Did that seem like a positive change to you, professionally speaking?" Ms. Parker glanced toward her classroom door before lowering her voice. "Honestly, no. Sophie's behavior wasn't problematic before. She was a normal, occasionally high-spirited child processing her mother's remarriage and her father's absence. What I see now concerns me more than any of her previous behaviors. She doesn't interact with other children during recess. She follows rules with almost obsessive precision. When asked about her feelings on any subject, she gives textbook responses rather than personal ones. She hesitated, then continued, "I've raised my concerns with the school counselor, but Dr. Hayes is highly respected in this community. His assessment carries significant weight. Have you noticed anything else unusual? Any specific behaviors that worry you?" Sophie writes in a journal throughout the day, not just during designated writing time, but constantly. She records everything she does, everyone she speaks to. When I asked her about it, she said Dad Richard reviews it every evening to monitor her compliance with treatment protocols. That struck me as excessive. Marcus nodded, mentally adding this to his growing list of red flags. "There's something else," Ms. Parker added, lowering her voice further. "Twice now, Sophie has fallen asleep in class. Not the typical head nodding of a tired child, but a sudden deep sleep that was difficult to wake her from. When I called Dr. Hayes about it, he said it was a known side effect of her medication adjustments, and that I shouldn't be concerned." "Did he say what medication she's taking?" "No, and when I asked the school nurse, she said the information was confidential, which is unusual. We typically have detailed information about students' medications in case of emergency." As their conversation concluded, Ms. Parker hesitated before offering one final observation. "Mr. Wilson, I don't want to overstep my bounds, but Sophie was happier before these interventions began. Whatever issues she was having seemed normal for a child her age going through family changes. What I see now," she shook her head, "it doesn't feel like healing to me." Marcus thanked her for her candor, feeling both validated in his concerns and increasingly alarmed about what might be happening behind closed doors at the Hayes residence. That evening, as Marcus sat in his apartment reviewing his notes from the meeting with Mrs. Parker, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Anna's number. "Marcus, we need to talk about what happened during your time with Sophie." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "She's been dysregulated since she returned home. Richard had to increase her evening dose just to help her sleep. He says you deliberately undermined her treatment plan. I spent time with my daughter, Anna. We hiked, we talked, we enjoyed each other's company. If that's undermining her treatment, maybe the treatment is the problem." Anna's voice hardened. "Richard is trying to help her. Do you think I would allow anything that wasn't in Sophie's best interest? I think you're trusting someone who has convinced you that normal childhood behaviors are symptoms of a disorder. Sophie doesn't need to be fixed, Anna. She needs to be allowed to be a child." "You weren't here, Marcus. You didn't see how difficult things became. Sophie was acting out, having tantrums, defying every rule. Richard recognized the signs of her condition when no one else did." "What condition exactly? What's the specific diagnosis that justifies medicating her into a walking automaton?" There was a pause before Anna answered, her voice suddenly less certain. It's a complex presentation of anxiety and attention deficit with emotional regulation challenges." "That's not a diagnosis, Anna. Those are descriptions of behaviors that every child displays at some point. Has Richard ever provided actual medical documentation of these supposed conditions?" Another pause, longer this time. "Richard says traditional diagnostic labels are limiting and don't capture the complexity of neuropsychological development." Marcus recognized the words as Richard's, not Anna's, phrases she had accepted without question from the authoritative doctor she had married. "Anna, something is wrong here. The Sophie I spent time with yesterday, when she was briefly free from Richard's influence and medication, was a normal, happy child. The Sophie who returns to your house moves like a robot, speaks like a psychiatric textbook, and lives in fear of disappointing Richard. Can't you see what's happening? What I see is that you've been back for 5 minutes and you're already trying to undermine the stability we've built. Richard warned me this might happen, that you might struggle with seeing Sophie receiving help that you can't provide yourself." The conversation deteriorated further, ending with Anna informing Marcus that Richard had suggested temporarily limiting unsupervised visitation until the treatment plan can be restabilized. The implication was clear: challenge Richard's authority over Sophie's care, and Marcus's access to his daughter would be restricted. After hanging up, Marcus sat in stunned silence. The situation was worse than he had initially feared. Richard's control extended beyond Sophie to Anna as well, who had surrendered her parental judgment to his professional authority. And now they were threatening to cut off Marcus's access to his daughter, his only opportunity to understand what was truly happening and potentially help her. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, replaying every interaction with Sophie, every concerning comment, every red flag. By morning, he had made a decision. If Richard Hayes was using his professional position to control and manipulate Sophie under the guise of treatment, Marcus needed proof, not just for Anna or school officials, but potentially for the authorities. He remembered Sophie mentioning her special hiding place, still existing in her bedroom, the loose baseboard in her closet where they used to hide treasures and secret notes. If he could somehow get a message to her, encourage her to document her experiences in a journal that Richard wouldn't find. But that would take time, and Marcus was increasingly convinced that Sophie needed help immediately. As he was considering his options, his phone rang again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. "Is this Marcus Wilson?" The female voice on the other end was hushed, as if the caller was worried about being overheard. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Sarah Collins. I was a nurse at Cedar Grove Medical Center until 3 months ago. I worked with Dr. Richard Hayes. We need to talk about your daughter." "My name is Sarah Collins. I was a nurse at Cedar Grove Medical Center until 3 months ago. I worked with Dr. Richard Hayes. We need to talk about your daughter." Marcus's pulse quickened. After a moment's hesitation, he replied, "How did you get my number?" "I called your ex-wife's house looking for you. Said I was from the VA about your benefits. Richard answered and said you weren't living there but might be reached at this number. I didn't give my real name." The caution in her voice suggested she understood the risk she was taking. "Why are you calling me about Sophie?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me? There's a coffee shop on the edge of town, the Blue Kettle. It's usually empty this time of day." 30 minutes later, Marcus sat in a corner booth at the Blue Kettle, a small, faded establishment whose better days were at least a decade in the past. The few patrons were elderly men reading newspapers or working crossword puzzles, paying no attention to anyone else. When Sarah Collins entered, Marcus recognized her immediately, not from personal knowledge, but from the way she scanned the room before approaching, the way she chose a seat that allowed her to watch both the door and the windows. She had the practiced caution of someone who knew what it meant to be afraid. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of face that seemed more accustomed to concern than smiles. She wore no nurse's uniform now, just jeans and a plain sweater that suggested a life deliberately kept low profile. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the booth. "I wasn't sure you would come." "You mentioned my daughter, that's all it takes," Sarah nodded, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, as if seeking warmth despite the mild temperature of the cafe. "I worked closely with Richard Hayes for 3 years in the pediatric psychiatric unit. At first, I thought he was brilliant. His ability to connect with troubled children, to gain their trust, seemed almost miraculous. But over time, I noticed patterns that disturbed me." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Hayes has a particular interest in what he calls high-potential cases, children who display intelligence, creativity, and strong emotional responses. Children like Sophie." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What does he do with these high-potential cases?" Sarah's voice dropped lower, though no one was paying attention to their conversation. "Officially, he's researching novel approaches to childhood anxiety and attention disorders. He's published several papers on the benefits of his multimodal therapeutic approach, which combines medication, cognitive restructuring, and what he calls environmental optimization." "And unofficially?" Sarah's knuckles whitened around her mug. "Unofficially, I believe he's conducting unsanctioned drug trials using children whose parents trust him implicitly. I think he's testing combinations of psychiatric medications that haven't been approved for pediatric use, documenting the effects, and using the data for his research without proper oversight or consent." Marcus felt sick. "What kind of medications?" "I'm not certain of all of them. The paperwork always listed approved medications like standard SSRIs or stimulants, but I noticed discrepancies, pills that didn't match their descriptions. dosages that seemed excessive for children, medications being administered on schedules that made no clinical sense. Did you report this? Sarah's bitter laugh held no humor. I tried. I went to the hospital ethics committee. 2 days later, I was called into administration and informed that I was under investigation for medication errors that could have endangered patients. Errors that never happened. The message was clear. Pursue this, and my career would be over. But you left anyway. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't be part of it anymore. But leaving didn't stop me from worrying about those children. When I heard through former colleagues that Richard Hayes had married a woman with a young daughter, I started monitoring the situation as best I could from a distance. Then I saw you with Sophie at the nature preserve yesterday. Marcus tensed. You were watching us? Not intentionally. I hike there sometimes. I recognized Sophie from photographs in Richard's office. But she looked different. Alive, energetic. Then later, I saw the transformation as you headed back to the car. It was like watching a light being extinguished. The description hit Marcus like a physical blow, perfectly capturing what he had witnessed. That's exactly what happened. She was herself for a few hours and then she became what Richard has programmed her to be, Sarah finished. It's his specialty, creating compliant, high-functioning children who no longer present any of the messy, inconvenient behaviors of childhood. Parents and teachers praise the transformation, never questioning what's been lost in the process. Marcus leaned forward, his voice urgent. I need to know what these medications might be doing to Sophie, and I need evidence of what Hayes is really up to. Sarah hesitated, then reached into her bag and withdrew a small notebook. This is everything I managed to document before I left. Medication discrepancies, unusual protocols, patterns I observed in the children under his care. It's not definitive proof, but it might help you understand what you're dealing with. As Marcus reached for the notebook, Sarah didn't immediately release it. Be careful, Marcus. Richard Hayes isn't just a doctor with questionable ethics. He's a man who believes absolutely in his own superiority. Intellectually, morally, professionally, people who challenge that belief tend to find themselves discredited, their concerns dismissed as misunderstandings or, worse, signs of their own psychological instability. He's already started that process with me, suggesting I might need help adjusting to civilian life, implying I might not understand Sophie's needs because of my absence. Sarah nodded grimly. Classic Richard. He'll build a narrative where you're the unstable element, the threat to Sophie's well-being. And he has the professional credentials and community standing to make that narrative stick. What about the medications? If I could prove Sophie's being given something inappropriate, you'd need a blood test. But Richard would have to consent to that as her physician of record. And even if you managed it somehow, he'd have a perfectly reasonable explanation for anything found in her system. Marcus's frustration mounted. There has to be something I can do. There is. Document everything. Build your case methodically. Find allies, teachers, other medical professionals, anyone who might have noticed concerning patterns. And most importantly, keep connecting with Sophie. The real Sophie, not the version Richard is creating. She mentioned something called the quiet room in their basement, a place he puts her when she's being defiant. Sarah's expression darkened. That's new. He used to talk theoretically about neutral environmental conditioning spaces where children could experience the absence of stimulation as a consequence for disruptive behavior. I never thought he'd actually implement something like that in a home setting. She said he leaves her there for hours. Sarah closed her eyes briefly as if pained by the information. That's not therapy. That's punishment disguised as treatment, possibly even abuse. How do I prove it? You'd need to document the room's existence, ideally with photographs. You'd need testimony from Sophie about her experiences there, and you'd need credible witnesses to corroborate that this is part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. Marcus nodded, mentally formulating a plan. I should warn you, Sarah added, if you challenge Richard directly, he'll escalate. He won't just defend himself, he'll work to remove the threat entirely. In this case, that means potentially limiting or eliminating your access to Sophie. He's already laying the groundwork for that. After yesterday, Anna called to say they're considering temporarily limiting unsupervised visitation. Then you need to move carefully. Build your case without tipping your hand, and watch your back. Richard Hayes has powerful friends and a reputation he'll protect at any cost. As their meeting concluded, Sarah wrote her phone number on a napkin. I'm taking a risk by getting involved, but I can't stand by knowing what might be happening to Sophie. Call me anytime, day or night. Ian Arlen. Thank you for coming forward. A shadow crossed Sarah's face. Don't thank me yet. I should have done more, sooner. Maybe then Sophie wouldn't be in this situation. After Sarah left, Marcus remained at the cafe, carefully reading through her notebook. The clinical language was sometimes difficult to decipher, but the patterns she had documented were clear enough. Children entering Hayes's care with typical childhood behavioral issues and emerging as eerily perfect, compliant versions of themselves. Their personalities flattened, their emotional responses dulled. One case in particular caught his attention. A 9-year-old boy whose treatment notes included references to persistent creative ideation requiring aggressive management and successful suppression of emotional ability through combined pharmaceutical intervention. The before and after assessments described a transformation from a disruptive, emotionally volatile but creatively gifted child to a well-regulated, academically focused student with appropriate social boundaries. It read like the destruction of a child's essence, couched in language that made it sound like a medical triumph. Another disturbing pattern emerged from Sarah's notes. Hayes seemed to favor a combination of medications that included not just standard treatments for attention or anxiety issues, but also atypical antipsychotics and sedatives normally reserved for severe psychiatric conditions. Medications with significant side effects and limited research on their long-term impact on developing brains. If Sophie was being given these combinations, Marcus closed the notebook, his resolve hardening. He needed more concrete evidence. If Richard Hayes was experimenting on children, including Sophie, Marcus would expose him, whatever the cost. His first step would be to gather more information about exactly what medications Sophie was taking and their effects. His opportunity came the following Wednesday, when he was scheduled to pick Sophie up from school and spend the afternoon with her, according to their custody arrangement. Anna had called the night before to confirm the arrangement, her voice tense. Richard thinks it would be best if Sophie maintained her medication schedule during her time with you. I'll pack her afternoon dose. Of course, Marcus had replied, projecting cooperative reasonableness while internally rejecting the very idea. When he picked Sophie up from Oakwood Elementary, she emerged from the building with that same careful precision he had observed before, her backpack clutched against her chest, her expression neutral until she saw him. Then, just for a moment, genuine happiness brightened her features before the mask slipped back into place. Hello, Dad Marcus. Thank you for picking me up. In the car, once they were away from the school, Marcus broached the subject carefully. How are you feeling today, Soph Bear? She considered the question with the same deliberation she seemed to apply to everything now. I am experiencing appropriate energy levels and mood stability. That's not what I asked. A ghost of a smile touched her lips as she recognized the pattern from their previous conversation. I feel okay, not bad, not really good either, just quiet inside. Did you take your morning medication today? She nodded. Dad Richard watches me take it every morning. He says it's important to maintain consistent blood levels of the therapeutic agents. Marcus kept his voice casual. Do you know what medications you're taking? Sophie recited the information with practiced precision. I take Focrol for attention regulation, Comaxil for anxiety management, and a special compound Dad Richard formulates himself for what he calls my unique neurological profile. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. A special compound formulated by Hayes himself? This was worse than he had imagined. Does anyone else take this special compound? I don't think so. Dad Richard says I'm a special case. He takes notes when I have my evaluations and says my responses are very valuable for his research. Research. The word sent a chill through Marcus. Sophie wasn't just Hayes' stepdaughter. She was his research subject. Do you have your afternoon medication with you? Sophie nodded, patting her backpack. Mom packed it. I'm supposed to take it at 3:30 am. Would you show it to me? Sophie hesitated, clearly conflicted between obeying her father's instructions and her inherent trust in Marcus. Dad Richard says only he and Mom should handle my medications. I understand, but I'm your father, Sophie. I need to know what my daughter is taking. After another moment's hesitation, Sophie unzipped her backpack and removed a small pill organizer. Inside were three compartments, each containing different pills. One small white tablet, one larger blue capsule, and in the third compartment, two unmarked clear capsules containing a fine white powder. This one is Focuril, Sophie explained, pointing to the white tablet. This is Calmaxil, she indicated the blue capsule. And these are Dad Richard's special compound. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady despite his growing alarm. The special compound doesn't have a name on it? Sophie shook her head. Dad Richard makes it in his home office. He says it's customized for my specific neurochemistry. Marcus made a decision. He needed to know exactly what Richard Hayes was giving his daughter. Sophie, I'd like to try something. What if, just for this afternoon, you only take the Focuril and the Calmaxil, but not the special compound? I want to see if there's any difference in how you feel. Fear flashed across Sophie's face. Dad Richard says I need all of my medications. He says if I miss doses, I could experience neurological instability. Just one afternoon, Soph. If you start feeling bad in any way, you can take it immediately. I promise. After a long internal struggle visible in her expression, Sophie nodded. Okay, but can we not tell Dad Richard? This will be our secret, just between us. They spent the afternoon at Marcus's apartment. He had set up a small art area with supplies he remembered Sophie loving. Colored pencils, watercolors, clay for sculpting. At first, she approached these materials with the same careful precision she applied to everything, creating technically perfect but emotionally vacant pictures. But as the afternoon progressed, and the time when she would normally have taken Hayes's special compound passed, a subtle change began. Sophie's movements became less mechanical, her speech patterns more natural. She began to experiment with the art supplies, creating images that weren't perfect, but had genuine feeling behind them. By 5 p.m., she was laughing as she shaped a lopsided clay turtle, unbothered by its imperfections, simply enjoying the creative process. The transformation wasn't as dramatic as during their day at the nature preserve. The standard medications were still in her system, but the difference was unmistakable. How are you feeling now, Sophie? She considered the question, tilting her head thoughtfully. I feel lighter, like there's more space in my head for my own thoughts. Usually by this time of day, everything feels very slow and far away. And that's how you feel when you take all your medications? She nodded. Dad Richard says that's how I'm supposed to feel, calm and controlled. He says when my thoughts race and I have lots of feelings, that's my brain malfunctioning. The clinical language in the mouth of a 10-year-old was jarring, especially as her natural speech patterns had begun to reassert themselves. Do you remember what you were like before you started taking any medication? Sophie's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. I remember being louder and getting in trouble at school for talking too much or not sitting still, and sometimes getting really mad or really sad really fast. Dad Richard says that was because my brain wasn't properly regulated. Were you unhappy then? The question seemed to confuse her. I don't think so. I remember being excited a lot and having fun. I don't feel excited much anymore. The simple statement broke Marcus's heart. As they continued talking, Sophie revealed more details about her life with Richard and Anna, the rigid daily schedule, the constant monitoring of her behavior, the therapy sessions, where Richard would question her for hours about her thoughts and feelings, recording her responses and adjusting her treatment plan accordingly. What happens during these therapy sessions? Dad Richard asks me questions and I have to answer honestly. If he thinks I'm not being honest, he says we have to keep going until I'm ready to engage productively. What kind of questions? About what I think about things, about my feelings, about my dreams. I used to have lots of dreams, but now I mostly don't remember them. Dad Richard says that's progress because dreams are unregulated brain activity. The clinical detachment with which Sophie described the systematic suppression of her natural emotional and cognitive functions chilled Marcus to the bone. Sophie, has Dad Richard ever recorded these sessions with a camera or audio device? She nodded. He records everything. He says it's important data for his research. He has a special computer in his office where he keeps all the files. He calls it his longitudinal developmental database. Marcus's mind raced. If Hayes was recording his sessions with Sophie, documenting his unorthodox treatments, those recordings could provide the evidence needed to challenge his methods. Does anyone else know about these recordings? Your mom? Other doctors? Sophie shook her head. Dad Richard says they're confidential research materials. He gets upset if Mom comes into his office when he's working with his files. As their afternoon together drew to a close, Marcus faced a difficult decision. Sophie was clearly benefiting from the absence of Hayes's special compound, showing more animation and natural childlike behavior than she had since his return. But sending her back without having taken it might alert Hayes that Marcus was interfering with the medication regimen. Sophie, I think it's time for you to take your special medicine now before we head back. The light in her eyes dimmed visibly. Do I have to? I like feeling this way better. I know, sweetheart, but we don't want Dad Richard to know we're investigating his medicine yet. It's like a secret mission, and sometimes on missions, you have to do hard things to protect your cover. The military analogy seemed to resonate with her. She nodded solemnly. Like being a spy behind enemy lines. The innocence of the question contrasted sharply with its implications. In Sophie's mind, was Richard Hayes already categorized as an enemy? Something like that, just for now, until we figure things out. Sophie took the 2 clear capsules, her movements reluctant but resigned. Within 20 minutes, Marcus observed the change, her posture stiffening, her expressions becoming more controlled, and the spontaneity draining from her interactions. By the time they arrived back at the Hayes residence, she had fully reassumed her mask of perfect, regulated behavior. Richard greeted them at the door, his assessment of Sophie immediate and clinical. Welcome back, Sophie. How was your afternoon? It was productive and enjoyable within appropriate parameters, Dad Richard. Hayes nodded approvingly before turning to Marcus. Thank you for following the medication schedule. Consistency is crucial for Sophie's progress. Marcus maintained his facade of cooperative interest. Of course, her well-being is my priority. Once Sophie had gone inside, Richard lingered at the door, his expression shifting to one of professional concern. Marcus, I've been meaning to ask, have you been experiencing any symptoms of post-traumatic stress since your return? Hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, emotional dysregulation? The question was posed with apparent solicitude, but Marcus recognized the strategy, laying groundwork to question his stability and judgment. Nothing beyond the normal adjustment to civilian life, he replied evenly. Why do you ask? Just professional concern. The transition from combat to civilian life can be challenging, and sometimes symptoms emerge in subtle ways, such as becoming fixated on perceived threats or conspiracies where none exist. The implication was clear. If Marcus raised concerns about Hayes's treatment of Sophie, they could be dismissed as paranoid thinking resulting from PTSD. I appreciate your concern, but I'm doing fine. My focus is on reconnecting with Sophie and supporting her development. Hayes nodded, his smile not reaching his eyes. That's commendable. And please know that Anna and I are committed to facilitating a healthy relationship between you and Sophie within the framework of her treatment needs. The subtle reminder of Hayes's control over the parameters of Marcus's access to his daughter wasn't lost on him. As he drove away from the Hayes residence, Marcus's mind raced with everything he had learned, the special compound of unknown composition, the recordings of Hayes's sessions with Sophie, the basement, quiet room, the systematic suppression of Sophie's natural personality and emotions. He needed more concrete evidence, and he needed allies who could help him challenge Hayes's authority over Sophie's care. His first call was to Sarah Collins. Hayes is giving Sophie an unidentified compound he supposedly formulates himself. He's recording their sessions and documenting her responses as research data, and he's isolated her mother from any oversight of this process. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible over the phone. This is worse than I thought. If he's creating his own pharmaceutical compounds outside of regulatory oversight, that crosses a major ethical and legal line. I need to get a sample of this compound. Have it analyzed. That won't be easy. You'd need a sophisticated laboratory willing to run tests without the usual documentation. And even then, Hayes could claim it's a legitimate compound prescribed under a doctor-patient relationship. What about the recordings? If I could access those, that would be stronger evidence, especially if they show him administering unregulated substances or using coercive methods in these therapy sessions. But accessing his private files would be legally problematic. Marcus weighed his options. He was walking a dangerous line. If he overstepped legally, he could lose any credibility in challenging Hayes's treatment of Sophie. I need more allies, people who might have observed patterns in Hayes's approach to other children. I might be able to help with that. There's a child psychologist at State University, Dr. Elena Martinez. She's been critical of Hayes's published methodologies in the past. She might be willing to review the information we have so far and provide a professional perspective. Set up a meeting, and I want to talk to more of Hayes's former patients or their families. There have to be others who've noticed concerning patterns. Over the next week, Marcus methodically built his case. He met with Dr. Elena Martinez, who reviewed Sarah's notes and Marcus's observations of Sophie's behavior with growing concern. What you're describing sounds like behavioral conditioning rather than therapeutic treatment, she explained, her dark eyes intense behind stylish glasses. Hayes appears to be using a combination of medication, environmental control, and psychological pressure to suppress behaviors he deems problematic rather than addressing any underlying issues. Is that common practice? De Martinez shook her head emphatically. Quite the opposite. The ethical standard in child psychology is to work with the child's natural temperament and development, providing support and coping strategies rather than attempting to fundamentally alter their personality. What you're describing sounds more like compliance training than therapy. Could it be considered abusive? Potentially, yes, especially the isolation in this quiet room and the administration of unidentified compounds. But proving psychological abuse is notoriously difficult, especially when it's cloaked in medical authority. With Dr. Martinez's guidance, Marcus began to document Sophie's behavior more systematically, noting the dramatic differences between her demeanor when fully medicated versus when the special compound was withheld, recording their conversations with Sophie's knowledge and permission, and keeping detailed notes about every interaction. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins reached out to former colleagues and families who had worked with Hayes, carefully probing for experiences similar to Sophie's. Most were reluctant to speak openly. Hayes's professional reputation was formidable, and many parents were invested in believing their children's dramatic transformations represented healing rather than suppression. But a few shared disturbing stories. A mother whose son had become unrecognizable, so well-behaved but empty somehow after treatment with Hayes. A father whose daughter had developed concerning memory gaps about her time in Hayes' care. A former hospital administrator who had transferred departments after questioning Hayes' documentation practices. None of these testimonies alone provided definitive evidence of wrongdoing, but together they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Marcus also continued his scheduled visits with Sophie, carefully balancing his investigation with his commitment to supporting her authentic self. He developed a routine of forgetting the special compound during their outings, allowing Sophie brief windows of greater emotional and cognitive freedom, then ensuring she took the medication before returning home to avoid arousing Hayes' suspicion. During these periods of relative clarity, Sophie shared more details about her life under Hayes' care. The constant monitoring, the pressure to conform to his expectations, the fear of the quiet room that kept her vigilantly self-regulating even when Hayes wasn't physically present. "I have to be careful all the time," she confided during one such outing, her voice barely above a whisper despite them being alone in a quiet corner of the park. "Dad Richard says my natural tendencies are destructive to my development. He says every time I follow my impulses instead of his protocols, I'm damaging my future potential." That's not true, Sophie. Your creativity, your energy, your emotions, they're not problems to be fixed. They're beautiful parts of who you are. She looked at him with a mixture of hope and doubt. But what if Dad Richard is right? What if there really is something wrong with my brain? Sophie, I've seen you both ways. When you're taking all the medications and following all the protocols, and when you're just being yourself. And I can tell you without any doubt that there is nothing wrong with your natural self. Nothing that needs to be corrected or suppressed or controlled. Then why does Dad Richard say I need all these treatments? It was a question Marcus had been carefully considering how to answer. He didn't want to frighten Sophie or create divided loyalties that might cause her additional stress, but he also couldn't allow Hayes's narrative to go completely unchallenged. I think Dad Richard believes very strongly in a certain way of thinking and behaving, and when people don't fit into that way, he sees it as a problem that needs fixing, rather than just a different way of being. Sophie absorbed this, her brow furrowed in concentration. Like how he always says there's a correct way to do everything and anything else is inefficient or disruptive? Exactly like that. But if he's wrong about me needing to be fixed, why does Mom let him treat me this way? The question cut to the heart of what Marcus found most difficult to understand, how Anna could allow Hayes to essentially erase their daughter's personality. I think your mom trusts Dad Richard because he's a doctor and because she believes he wants what's best for you. And perhaps, he chose his words carefully, perhaps she finds it easier to have a child who follows all the rules and never causes problems, even if that means losing some of what makes you special. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. Sometimes I think she likes me better when I'm taking all the medicine and being quiet and perfect. She gets upset when I start feeling too much or talking too fast. Marcus pulled her into a gentle hug, his heart breaking for the impossible position his daughter had been placed in. Forced to suppress her authentic self to earn the approval of the adults who should have been protecting her uniqueness. I want you to know something, Soph Bear. I love you exactly as you are, noisy, messy, full of big feelings and wild ideas. You never have to be perfect for me. You just have to be you. She clung to him then, her small body shaking with the release of emotions she'd been taught to contain. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, there was a new resolve in her expression. I want to help you stop Dad Richard's special medicine. I don't like who I am when I take it. That's very brave, Sophie, but also potentially risky. Dad Richard has a lot of control over your life right now. I know, but I can do secret things to help, like I already started. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and concern. What have you been doing? I started a secret journal, not the one Dad Richard checks every night, a different one that I hide in our special place in my closet. I write down everything I remember about the therapy sessions, in the medicine, in the quiet room. And sometimes when I'm supposed to take my medicine but no one is watching, I hide it under my tongue and spit it out later. The revelation both impressed and alarmed Marcus. Sophie's initiative showed remarkable courage and self-awareness, but if Hayes discovered her deception, the consequences could be severe. That's very smart, Sophie, but also dangerous if Dad Richard finds out. I'm careful, and I have to do something. I don't want to disappear completely. The simple statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. His 10-year-old daughter was fighting to preserve her very self against a systematic effort to reshape her into someone else. You won't disappear, Sophie. I promise. We're going to find a way to stop this. As their investigation progressed, Marcus and Sarah identified a critical opportunity. Hayes was scheduled to present his research at a psychiatric conference in a nearby city, a 2-day event that would take him away from Cedar Grove. With Hayes gone, they might have a chance to search his home office for concrete evidence of his unethical practices. The plan was high risk, but potentially high reward. If they could locate the recordings of Hayes' sessions with Sophie, documentation of the unidentified compound he was administering, or records of his unauthorized research using children as subjects, they would have concrete evidence to challenge his treatment methods and possibly his custody influence. Anna will still be at the house, Marcus pointed out during a strategy session with Sarah and Dr. Martinez. But Anna works from home on Thursdays in her studio at the back of the house, Sarah replied. If you scheduled a visit with Sophie during that time, you could potentially access Hayes' office while Anna is occupied. Marcus was uncomfortable with the deception involved, but increasingly convinced it was necessary for Sophie's protection. Even if we find evidence, what then? Hayes has powerful connections and professional credibility. Who would believe our accusations? Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression grave. That's where I come in. If you can secure concrete evidence of ethical violations, particularly the administration of unregulated compounds or the use of children as research subjects without proper consent, I can bring that evidence to the State Medical Board and the University Ethics Committee. Hayes's reputation wouldn't protect him from a formal investigation backed by documented evidence. The plan took shape. Marcus would schedule an afternoon visit with Sophie during Hayes's absence, ostensibly to work on a school project that required materials at the Hayes residence. While there, he would attempt to access Hayes's office and gather whatever evidence he could find. The risks were substantial. If caught, he could be accused of breaking and entering, potentially losing all access to Sophie. But the alternative, leaving his daughter in the care of a man who was systematically suppressing her personality and administering unidentified substances, was unacceptable. As the day approached, Marcus prepared carefully. He researched the layout of Hayes's home office based on Sophie's descriptions, studied basic lock-picking techniques, and created a plausible cover story for his presence in the house. Sarah provided guidance on what specific documents or files might be most valuable as evidence, and Dr. Martinez prepared the formal complaints that would be filed if their search proved successful. The Thursday of Hayes's conference arrived. Marcus arrived at the Hayes residence precisely at the scheduled time, a folder of school project materials under his arm as a prop for his cover story. Anna greeted him with her usual practiced pleasantness. "Sophie's just finishing her afternoon study period. She'll be down in a moment. I'll be working in my studio if you need anything. Richard's at a conference, so it's just us today." "Thanks, Anna. We should be fine with the project. Sophie mentioned you have some art supplies we might use." "Of course. They're in the supply closet in the hallway. Help yourself." As Anna retreated to her studio at the back of the house, Marcus called up to Sophie. "Soph Bear? Ready to start our project?" Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression carefully neutral until Anna was out of sight. Then her face broke into a genuine smile as she descended to meet him. "I did what you asked," she whispered. "Mom's working on a big commission. She'll be in her studio with headphones on for at least 3 hours. And I found the key to Dad Richard's office." She slipped a small key into Marcus's hand, her eyes bright with the thrill of their covert operation. "Are you sure you want to help with this, Sophie? If we get caught—" "I'm sure, Daddy. I want to be me again. Not what Dad Richard is trying to make me." Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthened by his daughter's courage. "Okay, here's the plan. We'll start setting up the project materials in the dining room as our cover. Then I'll slip into the office while you keep watch. If your mom comes out of her studio, you give the signal we practiced, and I'll get out immediately. Sound good?" Sophie nodded solemnly, fully embracing her role in their mission. They proceeded according to plan, spreading project materials across the dining room table to establish their presence, then moving into action once they were confident Anna was absorbed in her work. Hayes's office was located on the first floor, a room Sophie was forbidden to enter without express permission. The door was locked, as expected, but the key Sophie had provided fit perfectly. Marcus slipped inside, closing the door silently behind him. The office was meticulously organized, reflecting Hayes's controlling personality. One wall was lined with medical texts and psychiatric journals. Another displayed framed credentials and awards. A large desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a computer and a single framed photograph of Hayes shaking hands with the governor at a charity event. Marcus moved quickly, knowing his time was limited. He began with the filing cabinet, which was also locked. Using the basic lock-picking skills he had practiced, he managed to open it after several tense minutes. Inside, he found patient files organized alphabetically. He quickly located Sophie's folder, which was significantly thicker than most of the others. Scanning it quickly, he found what he was looking for: detailed notes on the specialized compound Hayes was administering, including its composition, a mixture of sedatives, mood stabilizers, and what Hayes termed cognitive modulators, in dosages far exceeding standard pediatric guidelines. Most disturbing was Hayes's documentation of the intended effects: suppression of creative ideation, reduction of emotional lability, enhanced compliance with authority directives. Marcus photographed these pages with his phone, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and vindication. This wasn't treatment, it was chemical control. Next, he turned his attention to Hayes's computer. As expected, it was password protected. This presented a more significant challenge until Marcus noticed a small notebook in the top desk drawer with what appeared to be login credentials for various systems. Hayes's confidence in his office's security had made him careless. Using the credentials, Marcus accessed the computer and quickly located the video files Sophie had mentioned. They were organized by date and subject name, with Sophie's sessions comprising the largest collection. He selected a recent file and played a short segment. The video showed Sophie seated in a chair facing the camera, Hayes's voice audible from behind the lens. "Tell me about your feelings of resistance to the treatment protocol, Sophie." Sophie's expression in the video was tense, her body language defensive. "I don't like how the medicine makes me feel. It makes everything dull and far away." That's your disorder speaking, not your rational mind. Your natural neurochemistry creates distorted perceptions that the medication corrects. The discomfort you're experiencing is simply your brain adjusting to proper function. "But I don't feel like myself anymore." Hayes's voice hardened. "The self you're referring to is a construction of unregulated neural patterns. What we're creating through this treatment is your optimal self, the version of Sophie that can achieve her full potential without being hindered by emotional and attentional dysregulation." The clinical dehumanization in Hayes's approach was chilling. Marcus copied several of these video files onto a flash drive he had brought for this purpose, focusing on sessions that most clearly demonstrated Hayes's unethical methods. He also located and copied files related to Hayes's research, documents that revealed Sophie was not the only child being subjected to his specialized compounds. Hayes was using data from multiple patients to develop what he termed a revolutionary approach to pediatric personality optimization, with the apparent goal of eventually marketing his methods and compounds to a broader psychiatric audience. As Marcus finished gathering this evidence, he heard Sophie's warning signal. 3 quick claps, ostensibly part of a game they were playing, but actually alerting him to Anna's approach. He quickly closed the files, shut down the computer, and returned everything to its original position. He had just locked the filing cabinet and was heading for the door when he heard Anna's voice in the hallway. "Sophie, where's your father?" "He went to get something from his guaro," Sophie replied smoothly, exactly as they had rehearsed. Marcus slipped out of the office, locking it behind him, and moved quickly down the hallway toward the front door, as if he had just re-entered the house. "Oh, there you are," Anna said, emerging from the dining room. "Sophie said you wanted to get Garger." "Just getting my phone, left it in the console," Marcus replied, holding up his phone as evidence. Anna nodded, seemingly satisfied. "How's the project coming along?" "Great. Sophie's really got a knack for this kind of work." The remainder of their scheduled time passed without incident, though Marcus's heart continued to race with the knowledge of what he had discovered. When it was time to leave, he hugged Sophie goodbye, whispering in her ear, "You did great. We're going to fix this." Her answering squeeze communicated both trust and desperate hope. Once safely away from the Hayes residence, Marcus immediately contacted Sarah and Dr. Martinez, arranging to meet them at Dr. Martinez's university office to review the evidence he had gathered. "This is more than enough to justify a formal investigation," Dr. Martinez confirmed after examining the files. "The unauthorized pharmaceutical compounds alone constitute a major ethical breach. Combined with the video evidence of Hayes's psychological manipulation and the documentation of his unsanctioned research, we have a compelling case for the medical board and ethics committee." "What about Sophie?" Marcus asked. "Even if an investigation is launched, she's still in that house, still under Hayes' control." "That's where the legal system comes in," Dr. Martinez replied. "With this evidence, we can petition for an emergency custody hearing based on concerns for Sophie's welfare. Given the nature of the evidence, there's a strong case for temporary removal from the Hayes household pending a full investigation." "Anna will fight it. She believes everything Hayes tells her." "Perhaps," Sarah interjected, "but remember that Anna is also a victim of Hayes' manipulation. When she sees the evidence, especially the videos of Sophie's distress and Hayes' dismissal of it, she might begin to question his methods." "We need to move quickly," Dr. Martinez urged. "Hayes returns from the conference tomorrow. Once he's back, Sophie's situation could become even more precarious, especially if he suspects any investigation." They spent the next several hours preparing their case, organizing the evidence, drafting formal complaints, and consulting with a family law attorney recommended by DeMartinez. By midnight, they had assembled a comprehensive dossier documenting Hayes's ethical violations and the potential harm to Sophie and other children under his care. The next morning, Marcus filed for an emergency custody hearing, submitting the evidence they had gathered as justification for immediate intervention. The family court judge, upon reviewing the documents, particularly the composition of Hayes's specialized compound and the video evidence of his psychological approach, granted the emergency petition. By the time Richard Hayes returned from his conference that afternoon, he was met by a family court representative and a police officer serving him with papers for both the custody hearing and the medical board investigation. Marcus waited anxiously at the courthouse, where Sophie would be brought for a preliminary evaluation before a decision on temporary custody was made. When she arrived, escorted by the court representative, her expression reflected confusion and fear. "Daddy, what's happening? They came to the house and said I had to come here." Marcus knelt to her level, keeping his voice gentle but honest. "We found evidence that Dad Richard's medicines and therapy methods might be hurting you instead of helping. The court is going to look at this evidence and decide if you should stay somewhere else while they figure everything out. With you. That's what I'm asking for, yes." Relief flooded her features. "Is Dad Richard in trouble?" "He's being investigated. The important thing is making sure you're safe and can start feeling like yourself again." Anna arrived shortly afterward, her face pale with shock and anger. "What have you done, Marcus? You broke into our home? Stole confidential medical files? Do you have any idea the damage you've caused?" "I've seen the evidence, Anna. Hayes isn't treating Sophie. He's experimenting on her. He's giving her unregulated compounds and psychologically manipulating her to suppress her natural personality. That's not therapy, it's abuse. Richard is a respected doctor. He wouldn't harm Sophie. Watch the videos, Anna. Look at the files. See for yourself what he's doing to our daughter." Before Anna could respond, the court representative approached. "The judge is ready to see Sophie now. Then we'll proceed with the emergency hearing." The evaluation process was thorough but sensitive to Sophie's emotional state. A court-appointed child psychologist spoke with her privately. Then Sophie met briefly with the judge in chambers. Throughout, Marcus maintained a reassuring presence, careful not to influence her responses, but ensuring she knew she wasn't alone. When the formal hearing began, Hayes arrived with his attorney, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine alarm. The evidence was presented methodically. The pharmaceutical records, the video sessions, the research notes documenting Hayes's use of children as research subjects without proper oversight or consent. Hayes's attorney attempted to characterize Marcus's actions as those of a desperate, possibly unstable father interfering with legitimate medical treatment. But the evidence spoke for itself. The videos particularly were devastating. Sophie's visible distress, Hayes's dismissal of her experiences, his explicit goal of suppressing her natural traits and behaviors. Anna sat rigid throughout the proceedings, her expression shifting from defensive anger to confusion to horror as the full scope of Hayes's methods became clear. When the video showed Sophie describing how the medications made her feel empty and Hayes responding that her perceptions were irrelevant to the treatment objectives, Anna visibly flinched. The judge's decision when it came was unequivocal. "Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient cause for concern regarding Dr. Hayes's treatment of the minor child, Sophie Wilson. Pending a full investigation by the appropriate medical and ethical authorities, I am granting temporary physical custody to Marcus Wilson with supervised visitation for Anna Hayes." Hayes's face darkened with fury, but his attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, clearly counseling him against any outburst that might further damage his position. Anna approached Marcus as they left the courtroom, her eyes red-rimmed but her voice steady. "I want to see the rest of the evidence, all of it. I need to understand what's been happening in my own home." "Of course, there's a lot you don't know, Anna. Hayes has been keeping you in the dark deliberately. If what you're saying is true, if Richard has been—" She couldn't complete the thought, the implications too painful to articulate. "We'll figure it out together," Marcus assured her. "Right now, the priority is helping Sophie recover from what she's been through." As they spoke, Sophie emerged from the conference room where she had been waiting during the hearing. Seeing both her parents together, apparently without conflict, her face brightened with cautious hope. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus knelt to her level. "You're going to stay with me for a while, Soph Bear, and we're going to work on helping you feel like yourself again." "No more special medicine?" "No more special medicine. Dr. Martinez is going to help us figure out if you need any medicine at all. And if you do, it will only be medicine that's been properly tested and approved for kids your age." Sophie turned to Anna, her expression uncertain. "Are you mad at me, Mom?" Anna knelt beside Marcus, reaching for Sophie's hand. "No, sweetheart, I'm not mad at you. I'm upset about some things I didn't know were happening, but none of that is your fault. I'm sorry I didn't see what was going on." As they left the courthouse together, Sophie walking between them, Marcus felt the first real sense of hope since his return to Cedar Grove. The road ahead would not be easy. Sophie would need time and support to recover from Hayes's manipulation. The legal proceedings would be complex and potentially contentious, and rebuilding trust between all parties would take patience and commitment. But today Sophie had been freed from Hayes's control. The truth about his methods had been exposed, and for the first time in too long, Sophie had a chance to rediscover her authentic self. Not the perfect, regulated child Hayes had tried to create, but the vibrant, creative, emotionally rich girl she was meant to be. As if reading his thoughts, Sophie looked up at him, a genuine smile lighting her face. "I feel different already, Daddy. Like something tight around me is starting to loosen. That's your real self coming back, Soph Bear. And we're going to make sure nothing ever suppresses it again." The next morning brought the beginning of what would be a long and challenging recovery process. Marcus had prepared his apartment as best he could, creating a bedroom for Sophie that honored her preferences rather than imposing adult aesthetics. Colorful bedding, space for her drawings on the walls, a bookshelf filled with the adventure stories she had once loved, for Hayes deemed them overstimulating. Dr. Martinez had referred them to Dr. Lillian Chen, a child psychiatrist specializing in recovery from psychological trauma, who would help assess Sophie's actual needs versus the constructed conditions Hayes had diagnosed. Their first meeting with Dr. Chen took place in her office, a warm, inviting space with comfortable furniture and gentle lighting, nothing like the sterile, clinical environment of Hayes's practice. "Sophie, I want you to understand something important, Doctor," Chen explained, her voice gentle but direct. "Everything we do here will be about helping you reconnect with your true feelings and thoughts, not about making you behave a certain way. There are no wrong answers, no incorrect emotions. This is a safe space for you to be exactly who you are." Sophie nodded, though the concept clearly felt foreign after months of Hayes's corrections and protocols. "Even if I get too excited or too man or too anything?" "Especially then. Emotions aren't problems to be fixed, Sophie. They're important messages from your mind and body. Our job is to listen to those messages, not silence them." Dr. Chen conducted a thorough but sensitive evaluation, focusing on understanding Sophie's authentic experiences rather than imposing external standards of appropriate behavior. She also began the careful process of assessing which, if any, of Hayes's prescribed medications might be addressing genuine needs versus simply suppressing Sophie's personality. "Based on my initial assessment, I believe Sophie may have some mild attention regulation challenges that could benefit from support," Dr. Chen explained to Marcus afterward. "But nothing that justifies the extreme pharmaceutical intervention Dr. Hayes was imposing. We'll work on a gradual reduction of the standard medications, closely monitoring how Sophie feels throughout the process." "And Hayes's special compound?" Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "That stops immediately. From what the laboratory analysis shows, it's a concerning mixture of sedatives and experimental neuromodulators that should never have been administered to a child. Some of the components aren't even approved for pediatric use in any context." "Will there be withdrawal effects?" "Possibly. We'll monitor her closely and provide support for any symptoms that emerge. But the risks of continued exposure to these substances far outweigh the challenges of discontinuation." Over the following weeks, Sophie began the process of rediscovering herself without Hayes's chemical and psychological controls. There were difficult moments, periods of emotional volatility as her suppressed feelings emerged. challenges with focus and attention as the medications were gradually reduced, nightmares about the quiet room in Hayes's therapy sessions. But there were also breakthroughs, the return of her spontaneous laughter, her creative imagination, her natural curiosity and enthusiasm. She began to express preferences without first searching for the correct response, to move with the natural energy of childhood rather than the controlled precision Hayes had demanded, to engage with the world around her with genuine interest rather than dutiful compliance. Anna, after reviewing all the evidence and speaking with other parents whose children had been under Hayes's care, filed for divorce and cooperated fully with the investigations into his practices. Her initial defense of Hayes gave way to horror and guilt as she recognized how completely she had been manipulated by his professional authority and controlled communication. "I thought I was doing what was best for Sophie," she confessed during a co-parenting session with Marcus and Dr. Chen. "Richard always presented everything in terms of Sophie's welfare, her potential, her future success. He made her natural behaviors seem like problems that needed solving. And I believed him because he was the expert, because he seemed so certain, so authoritative." Hayes is extremely skilled at manipulating perceptions, Dr. Chen observed. He uses his credentials and clinical language to create a framework where questioning his methods feels like rejecting science or harming your child. It's a sophisticated form of gaslighting that many highly intelligent people have fallen victim to. As the medical board investigation progressed, more families came forward with similar experiences. Children whose personalities had been systematically suppressed under Hayes's care. Parents who had been led to believe that their children's natural behaviors represented pathologies requiring intensive intervention. The evidence from Hayes's own files revealed that he had been developing what he termed a compliance-focused treatment model with the eventual goal of marketing it to schools, psychiatric hospitals, and even juvenile detention facilities. His vision, detailed in private research notes, was a system that could optimize child behavior through targeted neuropharmaceutical intervention and psychological conditioning. He wasn't just treating perceived disorders, Dr. Martinez explained during a meeting with Marcus and the legal team pursuing the case against Hayes. He was attempting to develop a methodology for reshaping children's personalities according to his own definition of optimal functioning: compliant, emotionally restrained, focused on academic achievement at the expense of creativity and social emotional development. The implications were chilling, extending far beyond Sophie's individual case to questions about the ethical boundaries of psychiatric intervention and the potential for medical authority to be weaponized as a means of social control. 3 months after the initial emergency hearing, the medical board announced its findings. Richard Hayes's medical license was suspended pending further investigation, with a recommendation for permanent revocation based on multiple violations of ethical standards, including administering unapproved pharmaceutical compounds, conducting unauthorized research on patients, falsifying medical records, and practicing outside the bounds of established psychiatric protocols. The criminal investigation was ongoing, focusing on potential charges related to child endangerment and unauthorized pharmaceutical distribution. For Sophie, these legal proceedings remained abstract background to the more immediate reality of her recovery. With support from Dr. Chen, her teachers, and both her parents, who were gradually rebuilding a functional co-parenting relationship, she was rediscovering the joyful, sometimes messy, always authentic experience of simply being herself. On a bright spring morning, 6 months after Marcus's return to Cedar Grove, he and Sophie sat on a blanket in Oak Creek Nature Preserve, the site of their first real reconnection. Sophie was sketching the landscape with bold, imperfect strokes, her expression one of complete absorption in the creative process. "Daddy, look," she exclaimed, holding up her drawing. "I made the trees all wonky on purpose because it feels more like how they're dancing in the wind." Marcus smiled, recognizing in this simple statement how far she had come from the rigid perfectionism Hayes had imposed on her. "They're beautiful, Soph Bear, just like the artist." She beamed at him, then returned to her drawing, adding splashes of color that corresponded more to emotional impression than literal representation. After a comfortable silence, Sophie spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I had a dream last night. A good one." "Tell me about it." "I was flying. Not in an airplane or anything, just me, flying over forests and oceans and mountains, and I wasn't scared at all. I was laughing the whole time. That sounds like a wonderful dream. Sophie nodded, adding a final flourish to her drawing. Dad Richard said dreams were just random brain activity that shouldn't be paid attention to. But Dr. Chen says dreams can tell us important things about our feelings. What do you think this dream was telling you? Sophie considered the question seriously, then smiled. I think it was telling me that I'm free now, that I can go anywhere and be anything, that I don't have to be afraid anymore. Marcus reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, her curls wild and untamed once again, exactly as they should be. I think you're right, Soph Bear, and that's a truth worth remembering. Sophie set aside her drawing and leaned against her father's shoulder, her body relaxed and trusting. I'm glad you came home, Daddy. I don't think I could have escaped the quiet room without you. Marcus wrapped his arm around her, his throat tight with emotion. You're stronger than you know, Sophie. You kept your true self alive, even when everything around you was trying to make you into someone else. That took incredible courage. We make a good team, she declared, reaching for another crayon to continue her artwork. The best, Marcus agreed, watching his daughter create with complete freedom, her movements uninhibited, her expression open and genuine, a child being exactly who she was meant to be, no longer forced to conform to someone else's definition of optimal functioning. The battle against Richard Hayes and his methods would continue in courtrooms and medical review boards, but the most important victory had already been won. Sophie was free, not just from Hayes's physical control, but from the psychological and chemical constraints he had imposed on her developing mind and spirit. As she hummed softly to herself, occasionally pausing to share observations about the natural world around them, or ideas for her next drawing, Marcus reflected on the strange mission that had defined his return to civilian life. He had come home expecting to face the challenges of reconnecting with a daughter who had grown during his absence. Instead, he had found himself fighting to liberate her from a different kind of captivity, one cloaked in medical authority and psychological manipulation. The military had taught him to identify threats, to develop strategic responses, to persist against overwhelming odds. Those same skills had served him well in this unexpected battlefield, where the weapons were evidence and testimony rather than firearms, where the objective was truth rather than territory. Daddy, can we build that treehouse now, the one we talked about before you left? The simple question carried layers of meaning, a desire to reclaim abandoned dreams, to create a space that was truly hers, to believe in possibilities that Hayes had dismissed as structurally unsound and promoting dangerous behaviors. Absolutely. We can start planning it today if you want. Sophie's smile was radiant, uninhibited by any imposed restraint or calculation of the correct response. I wanted to have a trap door and a rope ladder and windows on all sides so I can see everything. Then that's exactly what we'll build. As they began sketching designs for the treehouse, their heads bent together over the paper, Sophie's ideas flowing in an excited stream of consciousness, Marcus felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. This was what healing looked like, not the controlled, compliance-focused progress Hayes had engineered, but the messy, joyful, authentic process of a child reclaiming her voice, her imagination, her very self. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the ongoing legal proceedings and Sophie's continued recovery, this moment of simple connection and creative collaboration represented the truth they had fought to protect. That Sophie's unique spirit, with all its energy and emotion and imagination, was not a problem to be solved, but a treasure to be cherished. And that truth, once recognized, could never again be silenced by quiet rooms or special compounds or therapeutic protocols designed to suppress rather than support. Sophie was free to be herself, and in that freedom lay all the potential Hayes had claimed to nurture while actually working to destroy. The potential to grow into her authentic self, messy and magnificent, exactly as she was meant to be. When the day of the formal hearing arrived, the courthouse steps were crowded with media. Word had spread about the case against Dr. Richard Hayes, respected child psychiatrist accused of using experimental drugs on children, including his own stepdaughter. The story had touched a nerve, raising uncomfortable questions about the line between treatment and control, between medical authority and abuse. Marcus arrived early, accompanied by Dr. Martinez and their legal team. They had spent weeks preparing, gathering additional testimony from former patients, consulting with medical experts, and building an airtight case that left no room for Hayes's usual manipulative defenses. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Martinez asked as they approached the courthouse entrance. Marcus nodded, his expression resolute. "Sophie's counting on me. All those children are." Inside, the courtroom was already filling with observers, medical professionals, parents of Hayes's former patients, journalists covering what had become a landmark case in pediatric psychiatric ethics. Marcus spotted Anna sitting alone near the front, her face drawn with stress and lingering disbelief that the man she had married could have betrayed her trust so profoundly. The proceedings began with clinical precision. The prosecution presented its case methodically, laying out the evidence of Hayes's ethical violations, the unauthorized compounds, the coercive psychological techniques, the falsified medical records, the basement quiet room that constituted unlicensed confinement. Hayes sat stone-faced throughout, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but otherwise showing no reaction to the damning testimony. Only when the video evidence from his own files was played, Sophie's distress as she described how the medications made her feel empty, Hayes's cold dismissal of her experiences, did a flicker of emotion cross his face. Not remorse, but anger at having been exposed. When it was Hayes's turn to testify, he approached the stand with the same authoritative confidence that had convinced so many parents to entrust their children to his care. His defense was predictably sophisticated, framing his methods as innovative approaches to challenging cases, positioning his critics as resistant to cutting-edge therapeutic techniques, suggesting that the children's improved academic performance and behavioral compliance proved the efficacy of his treatments. "My research has focused on children with exceptional potential who are held back by emotional and attentional irregularities," Hayes explained, his voice measured and reasonable. "Traditional approaches often fail these children, leaving their gifts undeveloped. My methods, while unconventional, have consistently produced remarkable results: higher academic achievement, improved social adjustment, enhanced focus and discipline." "And at what cost, Dr. Hayes?" the prosecutor asked. "The elimination of joy, creativity, spontaneity, the suppression of the very traits that make these children unique. Those are subjective interpretations," Hayes countered smoothly. "What you characterize as suppression, I see as optimization, helping children achieve their fullest potential by removing the neurological obstacles that hinder their development, even if that means chemically altering their personalities without proper oversight or consent." Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "I have always acted in the best interests of my patients, using my professional judgment to address complex neuropsychological conditions that conventional treatments fail to adequately manage." The cross-examination continued for hours, with Hayes maintaining his professional demeanor even as the prosecutor methodically dismantled his defenses. When questioned about the special compound he had administered to Sophie and other children, Hayes described it as a customized therapeutic agent developed through his research, insisting that its formula was protected intellectual property and that its efficacy was proven by the behavioral improvements it produced. "Dr. Hayes," the prosecutor pressed, "are you aware that administering unlicensed pharmaceutical compounds to children without proper regulatory approval constitutes a federal offense?" "These were not commercial pharmaceuticals," Hayes replied, his tone dismissive. "They were individualized therapeutic formulations developed within the context of established doctor-patient relationships. The regulations you are referring to apply to mass-market drug development, not personalized medical treatment." It was the same linguistic sleight of hand Hayes had always employed, reframing potential crimes as medical innovations, ethical violations as professional judgment, controlling behavior as therapeutic care. But this time, his usual tactics were failing. The evidence was too comprehensive, the testimony too compelling, the pattern too clear to be explained away by clinical terminology or appeals to his professional authority. When Marcus took the stand, he spoke not with the clinical detachment of an expert witness, but with the raw honesty of a father who had nearly lost his daughter to Hayes's manipulative methods. "I returned from deployment expecting to find my daughter changed, older, maybe a little distant after so much time apart. What I found instead was someone almost unrecognizable, not just grown up, but fundamentally altered. The vibrant, creative, emotionally rich child I had known had been replaced by someone who moved like a programmed drone, spoke like a psychiatric textbook, and lived in constant fear of deviating from Dr. Hayes's expectations. Marcus described the transformation he had witnessed during his supervised visits with Sophie, how she gradually returned to her authentic self when away from Hayes's influence and medications, only to slip back into the robotic compliance he had engineered as they returned to his control. The most heartbreaking moment, Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion, was when Sophie told me she didn't want to take the medications anymore but was afraid of what would happen if she refused. She described being locked in the basement quiet room for hours if she displayed what Dr. Hayes called defiance, which could mean something as simple as asking questions about her treatment or expressing emotions he deemed excessive. Hayes's attorney objected, claiming Marcus's testimony was subjective and emotionally charged rather than factual, but the judge overruled, allowing Marcus to complete his account of Sophie's experiences. When Marcus stepped down, the courtroom was silent, the weight of his testimony hanging in the air like a physical presence. Even some of Hayes's most stalwart defenders among the medical community seemed shaken by the stark contrast between his clinical justifications and the lived reality of a child under his care. The final witness was perhaps the most powerful, Sophie herself, who had requested to speak directly to the court despite concerns about potential trauma. At 10 years old, she was technically too young to testify without special consideration, but the judge had granted an exception given her central role in the case and her demonstrated ability to articulate her experiences. Sophie entered the courtroom looking both nervous and determined. She wore a bright yellow dress, her own choice, Marcus knew, after months of Hayes-approved muted colors and formal styles. Her hair was in a slightly messy braid that she had insisted on doing herself that morning, a small but significant assertion of her returning autonomy. When asked to describe her experiences living with Dr. Hayes, Sophie spoke with a clarity and self-awareness that belied her age. Perhaps the one positive legacy of Hayes's emphasis on self-reflection, though directed toward authentic expression rather than the monitored compliance he had demanded. At first, I tried really hard to be what Dad Richard wanted, she explained, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. He said my natural self was disordered and needed correction. He said the medicine would help me become my best self, but really it made me feel like I wasn't me at all, like I was watching myself from very far away. She described the daily regimen of medications, the constant monitoring of her behavior, the therapy sessions where Hayes would question her for hours until she provided the responses he deemed appropriate, the quiet room where she would be confined for behavioral recalibration if she displayed too much emotion or independence. The worst part wasn't even the medicine or the quiet room, Sophie continued, her composure finally wavering slightly. It was feeling like nothing I naturally thought or felt was right, like the real me was wrong and needed to be fixed. Dad Richard said that was progress, learning to recognize and correct my dysfunctional patterns. But now I know that my feelings aren't dysfunctional. They're just mine. When Hayes's attorney began cross-examination, attempting to suggest that Sophie's perceptions might be influenced by her father's attitudes or by the reduction in medications that had been helping her manage genuine attention issues, Sophie responded with a directness that left no room for manipulation. I know the difference between medicine that helps and medicine that changes who I am, she stated firmly. The regular medicine for focus. I still take that sometimes, and it helps me concentrate without making me feel empty inside. But Dad Richard's special medicine made me stop caring about things I love, stop having my own ideas, stop feeling excited or sad or anything much at all. That's not getting better. That's disappearing. As Sophie left the stand, she paused briefly beside her mother, reaching out to squeeze Anna's hand in a gesture of reassurance that brought tears to Anna's eyes. The simple act of compassion, a child comforting a parent despite her own ordeal, spoke volumes about Sophie's resilience and essential character, qualities that had survived despite Hayes's systematic efforts to reshape her. After days of testimony, expert opinions, and legal arguments, the judge delivered her ruling with unmistakable conviction. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a disturbing pattern of ethical violations, professional misconduct, and potential child endangerment under the guise of psychiatric treatment. Richard Hayes has, by his own documented actions and statements, prioritized his research interests over patient welfare, administered unauthorized pharmaceutical compounds to minors without appropriate oversight or consent, employed psychological techniques that border on coercion, and created an environment of fear and control that undermines the fundamental principles of ethical medical practice. The judge's ruling was comprehensive. Hayes's medical license was officially revoked, criminal charges were recommended for review by the district attorney's office, and all of his current patients were to be immediately referred to a panel of independent psychiatrists for evaluation and appropriate transition to legitimate treatment protocols. Most importantly for Marcus and Sophie, the custody arrangement was permanently modified. Full physical custody was granted to Marcus, with Anna receiving regular visitation rights once she had completed a court-approved parenting course focused on recognizing and supporting children's authentic development. As the courtroom emptied following the verdict, Hayes was led away by his attorneys, his professional facade finally cracking to reveal the cold fury beneath. He paused briefly beside Marcus, his voice low and venomous. "You've destroyed decades of groundbreaking work because you couldn't understand the necessity of discipline and structure in child development. Sophie will regress without my protocols. You'll see I was right all along." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "What you call regression, the rest of us call childhood. Sophie doesn't need your protocols. She needs the freedom to be herself. Messiness, emotions, mistakes and all." Hayes's lip curled in disdain, but he had no further opportunity to respond as his attorneys ushered him from the courtroom, away from the media waiting to document his professional downfall. Outside in the warm spring sunshine, Sophie ran to Marcus, throwing her arms around him with the uninhibited enthusiasm that had once defined her personality and was gradually returning after months of careful recovery. "We did it, Daddy. We really did it." "We sure did, Soph Bear." Anna approached more cautiously, her expression a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and tentative hope. "You were incredible in there, Sophie," she said softly. "So brave and articulate. I'm so proud of you." Sophie smiled at her mother, the genuine warmth in her expression suggesting a path toward healing their relationship despite the trauma they had shared. "Dr. Chen says being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." Anna nodded, tears threatening. "She's very wise, and so are you." As they walked together toward the courthouse steps, Dr. Martinez joined them, her expression triumphant. "This is a landmark case," she explained. "The ruling will have implications far beyond Sophie's situation. The Medical Ethics Board is already discussing new guidelines for pediatric psychiatric treatment with specific prohibitions against the kind of practices Hayes employed. And several of his former colleagues have come forward with additional information about his research methods, which will help identify other children who may have been subjected to similar interventions." "Will they be okay?" Sophie asked, her concern for others touching in its authenticity. "The other kids like me?" "With proper support, yes," Dr. Martinez assured her. "Some of the effects of Hayes's methods may take time to address, but children are remarkably resilient. Just look at how far you've come in a few months." It was true. While Sophie still had challenging days, periods of emotional volatility, as she learned to recognize and express feelings that had been suppressed for so long, moments of anxiety when faced with situations that Hayes had conditioned her to perceive as threatening, occasional academic struggles as she adjusted to learning without the forced focus his medications had imposed. Her essential self was re-emerging with impressive strength. She laughed freely now, created without concern for perfection, expressed her opinions without first calculating the correct response, moved with the natural energy of childhood rather than the controlled precision Hayes had demanded. She was, in every meaningful way, herself again, not unchanged by her experience, but no longer defined by it either. As they reached Marcus's car, Sophie suddenly stopped, turning back to look at the courthouse with a thoughtful expression. "Is Dad Richard going to jail?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Anna, both of them uncertain how to address this complex question. The judge has recommended that the district attorney review the evidence for potential criminal charges, he explained carefully. What happens next will depend on their assessment of the laws he may have broken. Sophie nodded, absorbing this information with the same careful consideration she now applied to important matters. Not the anxious calculation Hayes had instilled, but a natural thoughtfulness that reflected her developing ability to engage with difficult concepts. I don't want him to hurt any more kids, she said finally, but I also don't hate him. Is that weird? Not weird at all, Marcus assured her, once again amazed by his daughter's capacity for nuanced emotional understanding despite Hayes's efforts to suppress it. It shows incredible emotional maturity to recognize that justice doesn't have to be driven by hatred. Chen says holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick. Sophie replied with the hint of a smile. I'd rather focus on getting better and helping other kids who went through what I did. Her words highlighted what Hayes had never understood, that emotional intelligence wasn't a weakness to be corrected, but a strength to be nurtured, that the very qualities he had tried to suppress in Sophie were essential components of the remarkable person she was becoming. In the months that followed the verdict, the full scope of Hayes's activities came to light as more families came forward and additional evidence was uncovered. What had begun as one father's concern for his daughter expanded into a comprehensive reevaluation of certain approaches to childhood behavioral management, particularly the use of pharmaceutical interventions to suppress rather than support children's natural development. Marcus became an advocate for greater oversight in pediatric psychiatry, working with Dr. Martinez to develop educational materials for parents about recognizing the difference between therapeutic support and personality suppression disguised as treatment. Sarah Collins, whose testimony had been crucial in building the case against Hayes, returned to nursing in a new hospital, this time with a focus on patient advocacy and ethical oversight. Anna, after completing the court-mandated parenting course and ongoing therapy to address how she had been manipulated by Hayes, gradually rebuilt her relationship with Sophie. While the trauma they had shared would always be part of their history, they found a new foundation based on honest communication and genuine acceptance, rather than the performance of perfection Hayes had demanded. 6 months after the verdict, Marcus, Sophie, and Anna gathered with friends and supportive professionals who had helped in their journey for a small celebration in the backyard of Marcus's new home, a modest house with a large yard where Sophie could play freely, and yes, a newly constructed treehouse in the oak tree that dominated the back corner of the property. The treehouse had been a family project, designed primarily by Sophie with input from both Marcus and Anna, constructed over weekends with help from friends, decorated with colorful pillows, string lights, and Sophie's increasingly confident artwork. It featured the trapdoor and rope ladder she had requested, along with windows on all sides, so I can see everything. As the adults chatted and shared refreshments on the patio, Sophie led a small group of children, some from her school, others she had met through the support group for kids affected by Hayes's methods, up to the treehouse for what she called a freedom meeting. Dr. Chen, who had been instrumental in Sophie's recovery and now served as a consultant for several of the other affected children, smiled as she watched them climb the rope ladder, their laughter floating down from above. That's the most beautiful sound in the world, she observed, children being simply, authentically themselves. Marcus nodded in agreement, his heart full as he observed Sophie's animated gestures visible through the treehouse window as she apparently told her friends some elaborate story, her expression unrestrained, her movements natural and energetic. There were moments I feared I'd never hear that sound from Sophie again, he admitted, when Hayes had her so tightly controlled that even her laughter seemed programmed. The impulse to control children's development is nothing new, Dr. Chen reflected. But Hayes took it to an extreme by cloaking it in medical authority and pharmaceutical intervention. What makes his approach particularly insidious is that on the surface, it produced what many parents and educators think they want: compliant, high-achieving, well-behaved children. At the cost of everything that makes childhood valuable, Anna added quietly, her ongoing guilt about her role in Sophie's ordeal balanced by her genuine commitment to supporting her daughter's authentic development now. Exactly, Dr. Chen agreed. Hayes fundamentally misunderstood, or perhaps deliberately rejected, the purpose of child development. He saw the messy, emotional, sometimes chaotic nature of childhood as a problem to be solved rather than a necessary and valuable stage of human growth. From the treehouse came a chorus of giggles, followed by Sophie's voice calling down, "Daddy, we need more snacks up here. Important freedom business requires fuel." Marcus laughed, the simple joy of the moment a powerful contrast to the controlled environment Hayes had created. "Coming right up, freedom fighters." As he gathered additional snacks from the kitchen, Marcus reflected on how far they had come since his return to Cedar Grove. What had begun as a mission to reconnect with his daughter after years of deployment had transformed into a battle to liberate her from a different kind of captivity, one cloaked in medical terminology and professional authority, but no less destructive to her essential self. The military had taught him to recognize threats, to develop strategic responses, to persist against overwhelming odds. Those same skills had served him well in this unexpected battlefield, where the weapons were evidence and testimony rather than firearms, where the objective was truth rather than territory. Now watching Sophie flourish in her recovered freedom, making messes and mistakes, experiencing and expressing the full range of emotions, pursuing her interests with genuine enthusiasm rather than calculated performance, Marcus understood that this mission, unlike his military deployments, would never truly end. The battle against Hayes's direct influence had been won, but the broader war against forces that would suppress children's authentic development for the sake of adult convenience or societal conformity continued. As he carried the requested snacks to the treehouse, calling up to Sophie to lower the basket they had rigged for such deliveries, Marcus made a silent commitment to that ongoing mission. He would continue to protect Sophie's right to be herself, noisy, messy, emotional, imaginative, and absolutely perfect in her glorious imperfection. Sophie's face appeared at the treehouse window, her smile radiant, uninhibited by any imposed restraint or fear of disapproval. "Thanks, Daddy. We're planning a revolution up here." "A revolution? Against the forces of boring grown-up rules and sad medicine that makes kids stop being kids." Marcus laughed, his heart full. "That's a revolution I can fully support, General Sophie." She saluted him with exaggerated formality before dissolving into giggles and disappearing back into the treehouse, her voice joining the chorus of children's conversation and laughter that drifted down like music. This, Marcus thought, was what victory really looked like. Not the controlled, compliance-focused progress Hayes had engineered, but the messy, joyful, authentic process of a child reclaiming her voice, her imagination, her very self. The road ahead would have its challenges. Sophie would continue to process her experiences, learning to integrate them into her understanding of herself and the world without being defined by them. Marcus and Anna would continue the complex work of co-parenting after trauma, finding new ways to support their daughter's development while respecting each other's roles in her life. But in this moment, with Sophie's laughter echoing from the treehouse and the sun warming the garden, where friends and allies had gathered to celebrate their hard-won freedom, Marcus allowed himself to simply be present in the victory they had achieved together. Hayes had believed that control was the path to optimal development, that suppression of natural traits was necessary for success, that compliance was more valuable than authenticity. In Sophie, creative, compassionate, resilient, and increasingly confident in her own voice, Marcus saw the living refutation of that philosophy. She was thriving, not despite her freedom from Hayes's protocols, but because of it, growing into herself more fully with each day that passed without his chemical and psychological constraints.